The silence in the house was a physical thing. It was heavier than the scent of wilting lilies that still clung to the air from the funeral. For 78 years, Elizabeth Sterling had known sound in this house. The cheerful chaos of a young family, the comfortable quiet of an empty nest, the low murmur of the television during Richard's evening naps. Now there was only a void, a humming emptiness that emanated from one specific spot, the worn leather armchair by the fireplace. Richard's chair. It wasn't just empty. It was a hole in the fabric of her world. Elizabeth sat ramrod straight on the sofa, her black dress impeccable, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She felt like a visitor in her own life, watching a play she didn't understand. Her son Jacob stood by the window, his back to her. He wasn't looking at the manicured lawn his father had obsessed over. He was looking at his phone, his thumb swiping in a steady, rhythmic motion that grated on her nerves. He hadn't met her eyes once since they'd returned from the cemetery. Not really. His wife, Sophia, was the opposite. Her eyes were everywhere. They slid over the grandfather clock in the hall, the oil paintings on the walls, the hand-carved mantelpiece Richard had installed their 10th anniversary. Her gaze wasn't mournful. It was proprietary. It was the look of an appraiser. He was such a good man, Sophia said, her voice a little too loud in the crushing quiet. She glided over and sat beside Elizabeth, her hand landing on Elizabeth's arm. The touch was cool dry. "We'll all miss him terribly." Elizabeth didn't answer. She just stared at the empty chair. Richard's glasses were still on the side table next to a well-worn copy of a history book. It was as if he'd just stepped out of the room for a moment. "I know this is a difficult time." Sophia continued, her tone shifting, becoming more practical, more businesslike. "But there are things that have to be handled. Loose ends." Jacob finally turned from the window, his face a mask of strained neutrality. "Sophia, maybe not right now." "No, Jacob, it's better to be proactive." Sophia said, her grip on Elizabeth's arm tightening just slightly. She gave Elizabeth a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Mom, we'll need to have the house appraised soon. For the estate. Just to get a clear picture of things for the paperwork." The words hung in the air, sharp and ugly. Appraised, estate, paperwork. They were coroner's words, not a daughter-in-law's. Elizabeth felt a cold knot form in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't a wave of grief. It was something else, something icy and sharp. Dread. She looked from Sophia's bright, hungry eyes to Jacob's averted face. He wouldn't look at her. He couldn't. And in that moment, she understood. This wasn't about sharing a loss. This was about liquidating an asset. The house wasn't a home to them. It was the grand prize. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with their intentions. The silence of that afternoon stretched into a week of silent days. The casseroles from neighbours stopped arriving. The sympathy cards dwindled to a trickle. Elizabeth moved through her home like a ghost, the quiet pressing in on her, punctuated only by the ticking of the grandfather clock. She found herself spending hours just tidying things, as if organizing the clutter of her life could organize the chaos in her head. One afternoon, she decided to tackle the mountain of mail that had accumulated on the dining room table. There were still a few condolence cards, their cursive sympathies blurring before her eyes. Bills, junk mail, and then a crisp white envelope from her bank. Not the joint account she'd shared with Richard, but her own private savings account. An account Richard had insisted she maintain a nest egg he'd called her runaway money as a joke decades ago. It held $50,000, a sum she hadn't touched in years. She slit the envelope open with a silver letter opener. It was a standard monthly statement. She almost tossed it on the bill pile, but a single line item caught her eye. Wire transfer. Outgoing. The amount made her breath catch in her throat. $50,000. The entire balance. Gone. The recipient was a name she'd never seen before: Apex Holdings LLC. It sounded cold, faceless, predatory. Her first thought was a mistake, a bank error. Her second was a scam. She imagined a sophisticated cyber thief in some dark room on the other side of the world, plucking her savings out of the ether. The thought was terrifying, but impersonal. She walked on steady feet to the kitchen, picked up the phone, and dialed the bank's customer service number. The hold music was a tinny, synthesized version of a classical piece that made her teeth ache. Finally, a cheerful, professional voice came on the line. "Thank you for holding, Mrs. Sterling. My name is Brenda. How can I help you today?" Elizabeth explained the situation, her voice calm and measured, belying the frantic hammering in her chest. "I believe there has been a fraudulent transfer from my savings account." There was the sound of typing, a long pause. "I see the transaction here, Mrs. Sterling. A wire transfer for $50,000 initiated 3 days ago." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "I did not authorize it." Another pause, this one longer, more significant. Ma'am Brenda said, her voice losing some of its practiced cheer, "Our records show the transfer was authorized through the online banking portal. To complete a transfer of that size, the user would have had to correctly answer 3 security questions." The cold knot in Elizabeth's stomach, the one that had formed when Sophia mentioned the appraisal, tightened into a fist of ice. What? What were the questions? "I can't tell you the answers, of course, but the questions on file are your mother's maiden name, the street you grew up on, and the name of your first pet. Patterson, Elm Street, Buddy. Information anyone could find in a phone book or an old yearbook, no. The pet's name. Richard knew. Jacob knew. Sophia. Sophia had heard the story a dozen times at family dinners. The questions were a firewall, and the breach had come from inside the house. "Mrs. Sterling, are you still there?" "Yes," Elizabeth whispered. "Thank you, Brenda." She hung up the phone, her hand trembling. The impersonal fear of a faceless hacker evaporated, replaced by a much more intimate, much more sickening horror. She stared at the phone. She had to call Jacob. She had to hear his voice. She dialed his number. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice breathless. "Mom? Is everything okay?" "Jacob," she said, her voice flat. "Someone took all the money from my savings account. $50,000. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. It was a guilty silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained, too high-pitched. "What, Mom? That's terrible. It must be hackers. These guys are getting so sophisticated." "Did you call the bank?" "I did," Elizabeth said, watching her own reflection in the dark screen of the kitchen television. She looked old, fragile. "They said it was authorized online. With my security questions." Another pause. Longer this time. "Hackers," he repeated the word, sounding flimsy and absurd. "They can find anything online these days. Facebook, all that stuff. Don't worry, Mum. I'll look into it. I'll make some calls." "You do that, Jacob," she said softly, and the line between them crackled with everything he wasn't saying. He knew. Of course he knew. The strain in his voice wasn't concern for her. It was the panic of a poor liar caught in a terrible, clumsy lie. He was a terrible liar. He'd gotten that from Richard. She disconnected the call, the dial tone buzzing in the silent kitchen. The knot of dread had now become a certainty. This wasn't just about liquidating her home. It was about emptying her life piece by piece until there was nothing left. The lie hung in the air between them for days, a toxic cloud of unspoken accusations. Jacob didn't call back. Elizabeth didn't call him. The quiet in the house grew heavier, more menacing. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, the doorbell rang. It was so unexpected that Elizabeth jumped. Through the peephole she saw them. Jacob and Sophia standing on her porch, their smiles bright and artificial. They hadn't called. They'd just appeared. An ambush. She opened the door. Mom Sophia chirped, stepping inside and enveloping Elizabeth in a hug that felt like a cage. She was holding a thick, glossy folder. "We were just in the neighborhood. We brought you something." Jacob shuffled in behind her, his eyes fixed on the floorboards. He was carrying nothing. He looked like a child being dragged to the principal's office. Sophia guided Elizabeth to the living room sofa, the same one where the awful conversation about the appraisal had happened. "We've been so worried about you," Sophia said, her voice oozing a sympathy that made Elizabeth's skin crawl. All alone in this big house. It must be so much to manage. She opened the folder with a flourish, spreading its contents across the coffee table. They were brochures. Thick, expensive paper, filled with photos of smiling, silver-haired seniors playing bridge, doing water aerobics, and dining in a sun-drenched hall. The logo at the top was embossed in a gentle, curving font. Maple Creek Meadows, a premier assisted living community. "We found the most wonderful place for you," Sophia explained, tapping a photo of a woman doing yoga on a pristine lawn. "It's more like a resort than a home. Chef-prepared meals, daily activities, 24-hour nursing staff. It would be a gift, Mum. A way for you to live your golden years completely unburdened." Elizabeth stared at the brochures. The smiling faces seemed to mock her. The polished wood and manicured gardens felt like a luxurious prison. Sophia's words were a torrent of corporate jargon and feigned concern. She talked about downsizing your footprint, optimizing your wellness, and ensuring Elizabeth's cognitive safety. It was the most dehumanizing language Elizabeth had ever heard. She looked past Sophia to Jacob. He was standing near the fireplace now, staring into the empty grate, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His jaw was clenched so tight, a muscle jumped in his cheek. He was a portrait of misery and cowardice. "A gift," Elizabeth repeated, her voice low and steady. She pushed the brochures back across the table. "No." The word small and simple seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Sophia's practiced smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Mom, just look at it." She pressed, pushing the brochures back toward Elizabeth. "Think about it. No more cooking, no more cleaning, no more worrying about the stairs. This is my home," Elizabeth said, her voice gaining strength. She looked directly at Jacob, forcing him to meet her gaze. His eyes were filled with a wretched mix of guilt and desperation. "Richard and I built our lives in this house. My memories are in these walls. I am not leaving." This was it. The moment of truth. She saw the shift in Sophia's face. The mask of syrupy concern didn't just slip. It shattered. Her smile vanished, replaced by a tight, hard line. Her eyes, which had been performing sympathy, now glinted with cold, sharp impatience. Mom Sophia said, her voice losing all its warmth, becoming flat and metallic. "This isn't a choice. It's what's best for you. It's what's necessary." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was more threatening than a shout. "We've already put down a deposit. A deposit." The words landed like a physical blow. The $50,000. It wasn't stolen by a hacker. It wasn't lost in the digital ether. It was a down payment on her own cage. They had used her own money to begin the process of erasing her. Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at Jacob, who finally flinched, looking away as if her gaze had burned him. He knew. He had stood by and let this happen. Let his wife steal her money, her future. The offer wasn't an offer. The gift wasn't a gift. It was an eviction notice. It was an ultimatum, and the threat, unspoken but crystal clear, hung between them. "You will go, or we will make you go." The deposit wasn't just a number. It was a countdown. Every tick of the grandfather clock felt like a second dropping away from her life, her autonomy. The days that followed were a blur of quiet panic. Elizabeth found herself checking the locks on the doors, peering out the windows at unfamiliar cars. She felt like a prisoner in her own home, waiting for the guards to come and take her away. She avoided their calls. The phone would ring, and she would see Jacob's name on the screen, and she would just watch it, her heart pounding, until it went to voicemail. He never left a message. What could he possibly say? About a week after their visit, another envelope arrived. It wasn't a bill or a card. It was a large, stiff manila envelope with a return address from the Havenwood County Records Office. It felt heavy in her hands, official and ominous. She sat at the dining room table, the same spot where she'd discovered the bank theft, and slid her letter opener under the flap. Inside was a single folded document and a cover letter. The letter was dense with bureaucratic language, but certain phrases leaped out at her. Notice of recently filed deed, property transfer, parcel ID 77B431. Her address, her home. Her hands shaking, she unfolded the main document. The top of the page read in stark, bold letters, "Quitclaim deed." It stated in cold legal terms that one Elizabeth Sterling, the grantor, did hereby release, remise, and forever quitclaim her property to a new entity, the grantee, the Sterling Family Trust. She read it again, and again. A trust. She had never set up a trust. Richard had talked about it years ago, but they'd never gone through with it. This document claimed she had willingly signed her home, her life's single greatest asset, over to this mysterious trust. It was dated 2 days after Richard's funeral. A day she barely remembered, a fog of grief and sedatives. Attached to the deed was a copy of the final page, the signature page, and there it was her name, Elizabeth M. Sterling. It was written in a flowing, elegant script. It was a perfect signature. Too perfect. Her own signature had grown a little shaky over the years, the tremor of age visible in the loops and lines. This one was flawless, confident, smooth. She stared at it, a wave of nausea washing over her. She knew that handwriting. She had seen it on 100 birthday cards, on thank you notes, on checks written out to charities at fundraising galas. The graceful, slightly ostentatious loop of the S, the sharp, precise cross of the T. It wasn't her signature. It was Sophia's. A flawless, chilling forgery. Her mind reeled. The appraisal, the missing money, the brochures, the deposit. It was all one single monstrous plan. They weren't just trying to put her in a home. They had already stolen hers from right under her feet. But there was another document tucked behind the deed. She almost missed it. It was thinner, just 2 pages. Durable power of attorney. Her blood ran cold. This was worse than the house. So much worse. She scanned the text, her vision tunneling. It granted Jacob Sterling and Sophia Sterling complete and total control over all her affairs, her finances, her investments. And then the final, terrifying clause, her medical decisions. The power to provide or withhold medical care. The power to make life or death choices on her behalf. They hadn't just stolen her house. They hadn't just stolen her money. They had stolen her life, her very personhood. They had stripped her of her right to choose to live, to die, on her own terms. They could declare her incompetent, institutionalize her against her will, and there would be nothing she could do. This piece of paper, this forgery, gave them the power to erase her completely. Elizabeth sat there for a long time, the documents spread out before her on the polished wood of the dining table. The shock, the dread, the sickening fear. She felt it all recede. It was like a fever breaking. The heat vanished, burned away by a sudden, profound cold. It was the coldest she had ever felt in her life. It wasn't the cold of fear. It was the cold of absolute clarity, of ice, of steel. The grief for Richard was still there, a dull ache in her soul. But it was now joined by something new, something hard and sharp. Rage. Not a hot, screaming rage that would spend itself in tears and shouts. This was a cold, quiet, calculated rage. It settled deep in her bones, a core of pure, unyielding strength. They thought she was a fragile old woman, a grieving widow to be managed, manipulated, and discarded. They thought she was a loose end to be tied up. They had miscalculated. They had mistaken grief for weakness. They had mistaken age for irrelevance. They had signed her name, but they had awakened something they would never be able to control. Staring at the forged signature, Elizabeth made a silent vow. This was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of theirs. The silence in the house was no longer a comfort. It had become an accomplice. Each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall was a countdown. Each creak of the floorboards, a footstep that wasn't there. For 3 days, Elizabeth had moved through her home like a ghost, the documents from Jacob and Sophia sitting on the dining room table like a death sentence. The rage had cooled from a roaring fire to a single hard point of ice in her chest. Grief was a luxury she could no longer afford. Passivity was a verdict she would not accept. She sat in Richard's armchair, the worn leather cool against her skin, and stared at the telephone on the side table. It was an old landline, a relic she'd refused to give up. Now its solidity seemed like an anchor. Her hand wrinkled and, spotted with age, trembled slightly as she reached for the receiver. The plastic was cool and heavy. She punched in the numbers, her knuckles white. She had to do it twice. The first time, her finger slipped. On the fourth ring, a bright, clear voice answered, full of the easy energy of youth. "Grandma? Hey, I was just about to text you. Is everything okay?" Elizabeth took a steadying breath. "Mia, I need your help." The line went quiet for a beat. Mia's tone shifted, the casual cheerfulness replaced by sharp concern. "Grandma, what's wrong? You sound different." "I am different," Elizabeth said, her voice low and even devoid of the quavering panic Mia might have expected. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I don't need my granddaughter right now. I need the pre-law student. Can you do that for me?" "Of course," Mia said immediately. "What is it? What happened?" Elizabeth began to speak. She laid out the facts with the grim precision of a surgeon. The visit after the funeral, the brochures for Maple Creek Meadows, the sudden unauthorized transfer of $50,000 from her savings account, and finally, the documents, the quitclaim deed, the power of attorney. She described the signature, how it mimicked her own, but had Sophia's confident looping flourish. As she spoke, she could hear Mia's breathing on the other end of the line growing faster, sharper. When Elizabeth finished, there was a moment of charged silence. They did what? Mia's voice was a whisper of fury. No, they couldn't have. A quitclaim deed, a full power of attorney, grandma, that's not just predatory. That's a felony. Several of them. The bank confirmed the transfer. Elizabeth continued, her voice a monotone. It was authorized online. They used the security questions. My mother's maiden name. The city where Richard and I met. Things only Dad would know, Mia finished, her voice laced with a venom Elizabeth had never heard from her before. Oh my God. I'm going to be sick. He and Sophia? They're trying to have you declared incompetent, aren't they? That's the next step. They put you in a home, control your assets, and sell the house out from under you. That appears to be the plan, Elizabeth said calmly. The ice in her chest was spreading through her veins. It was a strange, clarifying cold. We're not going to let that happen, Mia said, her voice now a low, determined growl. Okay. Okay, I'm thinking. You haven't signed anything else, have you? You haven't agreed to anything. I have agreed to nothing. Good. Do not talk to them. Don't answer the phone, don't open the door. If they show up, you call me and then you call the police. Understand. I understand. Okay. The documents. The deed. You said it transferred the house to something called the Sterling Family Trust. That's correct. I'm looking it up now, Mia said. Elizabeth could hear the furious clicking of a keyboard. State Business Registry. Sterling. Sterling. There are a dozen, but nothing recent. Nothing filed in the last year under that name. What about the money? Elizabeth asked. The $50,000. The bank said it went to a holding company. Apex Property Solutions, LLC. More clicking. A pause. Got it? Mia said, her voice tight. Apex Property Solutions, formed 6 months ago. The registered agent is… Oh, you have got to be kidding me. What is it, Mia? The registered agent is the same lawyer who handled the closing on my dad's last condo project. The one that went belly up and cost him a fortune. It's a shell corporation, Grandma. It's a ghost company designed to move money. He funneled your savings into his own failing business. The betrayal was so vast, so complete, it was almost elegant in its cruelty. Elizabeth felt a wave of dizziness, but she gripped the arm of the chair and willed it away. This was not the time for weakness. What do we do? She asked. We fight, Mia said, her voice ringing with conviction. We need a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. We need a shark, someone who specializes in this. Elder fraud, financial abuse. She paused, and the clicking resumed more deliberate this time. I'm on the university's legal database, looking at pro bono networks. Wait. Here's someone. David Chen, young 35. Left a big corporate firm 2 years ago to work for the Oregon Legal Aid Society. His bio says he specializes in recovering stolen assets for vulnerable seniors. It says he's a pit bull. Perfect. Can we afford him? Elizabeth asked the practical question, a reflex from a lifetime of careful budgeting. He works on contingency or pro bono for cases like this, Mia read. He takes a percentage of what he recovers, or the court orders the other party to pay his fees when he wins. He's hungry, Grandma. He's trying to make a name for himself. He's exactly what we need. Mia's voice was filled with a fierce, protective energy that warmed the chill in Elizabeth's bones. I'm sending him an email right now. A summary of the facts. The forged deed, the shell corporation. I'm attaching scans of the documents. He'll call. I know he will. Mia Elizabeth said, her voice cracking for the first time. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Mia said softly. Save that for when we get your house back. Just stay strong, Grandma. Don't let them see you're scared. I'm not scared anymore, dear Elizabeth said, and was surprised to find it was the truth. I'm angry. 2 days later, Elizabeth was sitting at her dining room table, a laptop propped open in front of her. Mia was on the screen, having guided her through setting up the video call. A third window opened, and the face of David Chen appeared. He was younger than she expected, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an air of restless energy. He wasn't wearing a tie. He looked like someone who got things done. Mrs. Sterling, Mia, he said, his voice crisp. Thank you for meeting with me. I've reviewed the documents Mia sent. Frankly, it's one of the most brazen cases of fraud I've ever seen. So you'll take the case? Elizabeth asked, cutting straight to the point. David leaned forward, his eyes fixed on her through the screen. I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Sterling. These cases are ugly. They are wars of attrition. Your son and daughter-in-law will likely hire their own counsel. They will try to paint you as confused, senile, incapable of managing your own affairs. They will use your age against you. They will try to break you down. Are you prepared for that? Elizabeth met his gaze without flinching. Mr. Chen, My son and his wife have already taken my money, forged my name, and tried to dispose of me like a piece of old furniture. They have already done their worst. The only thing I am not prepared for is letting them get away with it. A slow smile spread across David's face. Good. That's what I needed to hear. He became all business. All right. To start, I'll file for an immediate injunction to block any sale or transfer of the property. I'll also file a motion to invalidate the power of attorney based on evidence of forgery and undue influence. But to build the larger case to prove a pattern of abuse and recover your money, I need everything. Every financial record you have. Tax returns, bank statements, investment portfolios, mortgage documents, deeds. I need the full financial history of you and your late husband. We need to go back as far as we can. 40 years, if possible. The scope of it was staggering. 40 years of a life reduced to stacks of paper. It will take me some time, Elizabeth said. Most of it is in Richard's old office. Take all the time you need, David said. But the sooner we get it, the faster we can move. Scan everything you can. Mia can help you with that. We're building a fortress, Mrs. Sterling, and every piece of paper is a stone in the wall. The call ended, leaving Elizabeth alone in the quiet house once more. But the silence felt different now. It was the quiet of a war room, the calm before a righteous storm. She pushed herself up from the table and walked toward the back of the house, toward Richard's office, a room she had barely entered since he died. The air inside was thick with the scent of him, old books, pipe tobacco, and something that was just Richard. Dust motes danced in the single beam of sunlight slanting through the blinds. It was a masculine space, organized in a way she'd never quite understood. The filing cabinets were heavy steel, the kind you'd find in a government office. She pulled open the top drawer. It slid out with a loud groan of protest. The files were meticulously labeled. Taxes, 1985 to 1990. Appliance warranties. Car titles. She began the slow, arduous process of pulling each folder, blowing off a layer of dust, and placing it in a cardboard box to take to the scanner. Each document was a small ghost of her past. The mortgage papers for this very house, signed with a younger, stronger version of her own name next to Richard's. A receipt for the crib they bought for Jacob. It was an archaeological dig through her own life, and with every layer she uncovered, the present-day betrayal felt sharper. She worked for hours, her back aching, her hands grey with dust. The boxes began to fill up. She'd gone through the filing cabinets and the desk drawers. David had said he needed everything. She remembered Richard kept a few old briefcases in his closet. Perhaps there were more records in there. She opened the closet door. The scent of his wool overcoats was strong, a sudden, sharp punch of grief that took her breath away. For a moment, she was just a widow missing her husband. She leaned her forehead against the door jamb, her eyes closed. But the image of Sophia's triumphant smile, of Jacob's averted eyes, hardened her resolve. She pushed the grief away and reached inside, pushing aside the heavy coats. In the back on the floor, tucked behind a stack of old sweaters he never wore, her fingers brushed against something hard and cold. It wasn't a briefcase. It was a box. A metal box, heavy and grey, like an old military footlocker, but smaller. It was locked with a sturdy built-in mechanism. There was no key in sight. She dragged it out into the light. It was heavier than it looked. She hadn't seen it in decades. She searched her memory trying to place it, and then it came back to her. A flicker of a memory from maybe 25 years ago. She'd been cleaning, trying to organize the closet, and had tried to move the box. Richard had come in and seen her. His face, normally so placid, had become a tight mask of anger. "Elizabeth, what are you doing?" He'd snapped, his voice harsher than she'd ever heard it. "Leave that alone. This is my space. Just leave it be." She had been so taken aback by his reaction, she had simply apologized and backed out of the room. She'd written it off as one of his strange quirks, his need for absolute privacy in his office. She never went near the closet again. But now, seeing the box in the stark light of 2025, knowing what she now knew about secrets, a cold tendril of dread snaked its way up her spine. Her image of Richard, the simple, steady, reliable man, began to crack at the edges. What was in this box that he had guarded so fiercely? While Elizabeth was unearthing the ghosts of her physical past, Mia was hunting for them in the digital world. From her dorm room, surrounded by the glow of multiple screens, she waged a quiet war. She was fueled by a cold rage she hadn't known she possessed. This wasn't just about protecting her grandmother. It was about the sickening realization that her own parents were monsters. She started with the obvious: social media. She scrolled through her mother's Instagram and Facebook profiles. It was a curated gallery of a life that didn't match the story of Jacob's failing business. A ski trip to Aspen in February, a new Tesla in the driveway in April, a weekend getaway to a 5-star resort in Napa just last month, with a picture of her mother raising a glass of champagne captioned, "To New Beginnings." The post was dated 2 days after they had taken Elizabeth's money. Mia felt a surge of nausea. She took screenshots of everything dating and cataloguing them in a folder labeled Evidence. But the lifestyle, while damning, wasn't a smoking gun. David needed a trail, a connection. Mia started thinking about her father's habits. He was meticulous, almost paranoid about his digital life. He had multiple cloud storage accounts, backups of backups. He had once lectured Mia for an hour about the importance of data redundancy. She had rolled her eyes then. Now it was a potential lifeline. She had an old family password, one they used for shared accounts like streaming services and photo albums. It was a long shot, but maybe he'd been lazy. She tried logging into his primary cloud account. Access denied. She tried his secondary. Access denied. Frustration mounted. She was about to give up when she remembered an old third-tier service he used years ago, something he'd called his Deep Archive. She found the login page. She typed in the family password. Access granted. Her heart hammered in her chest. It was like stepping into a digital version of her father's mind. There were thousands of files organized with obsessive detail. Folders labeled business receipts, 2005-2015, house blueprints, old tax filings. It was a maze. She told herself she was looking for photos in case he ever checked the login history. She browsed through folders of family vacations, her own baby pictures. It was a painful journey. Then she saw it. A folder named something innocuous, Misc Keep. It seemed out of place in the rigid filing system. She clicked on it. Inside were more photos, but also a single file that looked different. It wasn't a JPEG or a .doc. It was an encrypted spreadsheet file. A lock icon sat next to the file name Legacy Data Docs LSXC. She tried to open it. A password prompt appeared. This was it. This had to be something important. She tried every password she could think of. Birthdays, anniversaries, pet names, street names. Nothing worked. For 2 hours, she tried combinations, her frustration growing with each incorrect password message. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her eyes. Legacy. The word echoed in her mind. What legacy? She thought about her grandfather, Richard Sterling, RS. Her dad had always talked about upholding his father's legacy. She thought about the strange things, the political donations she'd seen on public ledgers while digging earlier. Her father and an anonymous benefactor always donating to the same local campaigns. It felt connected, but she couldn't see how. She typed in Sterling legacy. Nothing. Richard Sterling. Nothing. She needed a detail, a number. What was significant? She stared at the file name again. Legacy Data. She thought about her father's obsessive nature. He would have used something memorable, but obscure. What year did his father start the business? She didn't know. What year did they buy the house? She searched the old tax files she had access to. The date wasn't there. Then a random thought struck her. She remembered overhearing a conversation years ago, something about a bad year for the family business a long time ago. Her dad had looked pale, stressed. She remembered him mentioning a specific year in passing, 1995. It was a shot in the dark. She typed Richard Legacy, 1995. The password prompt disappeared. The spreadsheet opened. It was starkly simple. No fancy formatting, just 3 columns. Column A was a list of dates starting in June 2010 and continuing on the 1st of every month without fail to the present. Column B was an amount $5,000 every single month. Column C was a memo. The same 2 words repeated over and over down the page: RS Legacy Maintenance. RS Richard Sterling. Legacy Maintenance. Mia's blood ran cold. This wasn't about business. This wasn't about political donations. This was something else. She scrolled to the bottom of the spreadsheet. The final entry was from 2 weeks ago. Next to it, in the memo column, was a note she hadn't seen on the others. Final PMT Act closed. And next to that, a 4th column she hadn't noticed with a single entry next to the final payment, an offshore bank routing number. Untraceable. 15 years of payments. $5,000 a month. That was... Mia did the math quickly. $900,000. Her father hadn't just stolen $50,000 from his mother. He had been paying nearly $1 million to someone secretly for a decade and a half, and the payments had just stopped. Right after her grandfather died. Mia picked up her phone, her hand shaking, and called Elizabeth. The locksmith was a young man with kind eyes and skillful hands. He worked quietly, the clicks and whirs of his tools, the only sound in Richard's dusty office. Elizabeth stood by the window, not watching him, but staring out at her garden. She had told Mia what she'd found about the spreadsheet, the payments, the term legacy maintenance. Mia had insisted she open the box immediately. "It's done, ma'am," the locksmith said softly. Elizabeth turned. The lid of the heavy metal box was slightly ajar. She paid the young man, her hands steady, and saw him to the door. When she heard his van pull away, she walked back to the office and closed the door behind her. She stood over the box for a long moment, her heart a heavy rhythmic drum against her ribs. This was the point of no return. Whatever was inside this box would change everything. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and secrets, and lifted the lid. The first thing she saw was not money or gold or legal documents. It was a stack of yellowed newspaper clippings, bound with a brittle rubber band that snapped the moment she touched it. She picked up the top clipping. It was from the Havenwood Chronicle, dated October 17th, 1995. Fatal hit and run on Route 9. Police seek leads. She read the article, her eyes scanning the faded print. A young woman, a student at the local community college, had been killed while changing a flat tire on the shoulder of the highway. The car that struck her never stopped. There were no witnesses. The police had only a few fragments of a headlight to go on. The driver was never found. 1995? The year from the spreadsheet password. Her hands were cold, now numb. She put the clipping aside. Beneath it was another a week later. A photo of the victim, a smiling girl with dark hair. Her name was Amelia Vance. The article was an appeal from her family for anyone with information to come forward. Beneath the clippings was a bundle of letters, perhaps a dozen of them held together with a paperclip. They were typed, not handwritten, on plain, cheap paper that had yellowed with age. She picked up the one on top. It was not in an envelope. It was dated June 2010, the same month the payments in the spreadsheet began. The type was slightly uneven, the work of an old manual typewriter. She began to read, "I know what you did on Route 9. I know it was you. You think a secret dies just because time passes. It doesn't. It just gets more expensive. A ghost, that expensive, needs to be paid to stay quiet. 5,000 a month to a quiet place is a small price to pay to keep your perfect life from falling apart. The first payment is due on the 1st. Don't be late." There was no signature. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The words on the page blurred. Route 9, the hit and run, the ghost, RS Legacy Maintenance. It wasn't about maintaining a business or a reputation. It was blackmail. Her husband, Richard. Her quiet, steady, simple Richard. He had killed a girl, and he had paid for 15 years to keep it a secret. The full weight of it crashed down on her. The spreadsheet. The payments had been coming from Jacob's computer. Jacob had taken over the blackmail payments after Richard's health began to fail. He had known. Her son had known for years that his father was a killer. He had been an accomplice to the cover-up. The $50,000 he'd stolen from her, the attempt to seize her house. It wasn't just about greed. It was about a much larger, much more desperate need for money. The final note on the spreadsheet, final PMT, act closed. Had the blackmailer demanded a final lump sum payment to end it all? Is that what this was all about? Elizabeth sank into Richard's old desk chair, the letters spread out before her on the blotter. The whole edifice of her life, the 45 years of her marriage, the very foundation of her family, had crumbled to dust in a single afternoon. The betrayal wasn't just Jacob and Sophia's, it was Richard's. A lie she had been living in for nearly 30 years. She looked at her own hands resting on the desk. They were no longer trembling. A strange and terrible calm settled over her. The grief for the husband she thought she knew was gone, burned away by the acid of the truth. The rage at her son was replaced by something colder, sharper. It was the icy clarity of purpose. This was not just about a house anymore. It was about a dead girl named Amelia Vance. It was about a lie that had poisoned 2 generations of her family. And Elizabeth Sterling, the quiet widow, the grieving mother, was going to be the one to finally burn it to the ground. The silence in the house had a weight to it now, a physical presence that pressed down on Elizabeth's shoulders. It was a different silence from the one that had followed Richard's death. That had been the silence of absence. This was the silence of a truth taking up all the air in the room. On the coffee table, 3 objects formed a damning triangle. A yellowed newspaper clipping brittle at the edges detailing a tragedy from a lifetime ago. A stack of neatly typed anonymous letters, their words as sterile and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. And Mia's iPad, its screen glowing, displaying a spreadsheet of numbers and dates so clean, so logical, it was obscene. Elizabeth traced a line on the screen with a trembling finger. 15 years. The payments began 15 years ago. RS Legacy Maintenance. What a pristine, corporate-sounding name for something so rotten. She remembered that year perfectly. Jacob, so proud, so full of a nervous energy she'd mistaken for ambition, had just accepted a full-time position at his father's real estate firm. He'd come home with a bottle of champagne, his face flushed with the promise of a future he felt he was finally building for himself. But he hadn't been building. He'd been inheriting. Not a business, but a sin. A debt paid in monthly installments to a ghost. Richard had passed the burden on. The thought landed not with a crash, but with a quiet, sickening thud. The husband she had mourned, the man whose absence left an empty chair at the dinner table, had not been a pillar of strength. He had been a coward. A man who had killed someone on a dark road, and then spent the rest of his life paying to keep it quiet, finally offloading the sordid duty onto his own son. And Jacob, her son. The anger she'd felt towards him, that hot, sharp fury over the stolen money, the faked signature, it began to cool, to curdle into something more complex, something akin to a horrifying pity. His desperate, clumsy attempts to seize control of her assets, to push her into a home. It wasn't just the rapacious greed of a spoiled child. It was the frantic scrabbling of a trapped animal. He wasn't trying to build a new life of luxury. He was trying to buy his way out of an old one built on a lie. He needed a lump sum, a final silencing payment, and he had been willing to sacrifice his own mother to get it, the crushing weight of his father's crime. She could feel it now, a phantom weight on her own chest. For 15 years, Jacob had walked around with this knowledge, this poison circulating through his veins. Every family dinner, every holiday, every shared laugh had been a lie. He'd been performing a role, the dutiful son, while secretly managing the fallout of his father's unforgivable act. And Sophia. Sophia had been there right beside him, whispering in his ear, encouraging him, guiding his hand. Elizabeth looked at the forged deed on the table, her signature so crudely mimicked by Sophia's hand. She now held a weapon. 2 weapons, in fact. She could take the forgery to the police, expose Jacob and Sophia, and watch her son's life crumble into ruin. Or she could take the blackmail letters, expose Richard's secret, and obliterate the memory of the man she had loved for 50 years. The father Jacob had, in his own twisted way, been trying to protect. Her son's life, or her husband's memory, a cold clarity washed over her. It felt like stepping from a stuffy, overheated room into a blast of Arctic air. Both were already destroyed. The life was a sham. The memory was a fiction. They were props in a play that had run for far too long. The only thing left to do was burn the theatre down. She wasn't choosing between 2 people. She was choosing to destroy the lie itself. The lie was the disease. It had infected Richard, then Jacob, and through him, it had poisoned her. It had to be cut out. Not with rage, but with precision. She picked up her phone. Her thumb was steady as she found Mia's name. It rang twice. "Grandma, is everything okay? It's late." "I'm fine, dear Elizabeth," said her voice, even almost serene. "But I need your help. I'm going to talk to your father." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mia was smart enough to hear what wasn't being said. "What kind of help?" "I need a record of it, Mia. I need proof." Another silence, longer this time. "Then I'll be there in the morning." Mia arrived not with questions, but with a small, velvet-lined box. She saw the grim set of her grandmother's jaw, the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of a sleepless night spent with ghosts, and she understood that the time for questions was over. This was a time for action. Inside the box was a brooch. It was a heavy silver thing, fashioned into an intricate knot, with a small dark stone at its center. It looked like something Elizabeth might have owned for decades, a piece of vintage jewelry with a forgotten history. "It's an audio recorder." Mia said, her voice low and serious. She placed it in Elizabeth's palm. It felt cold, dense its weight, a strange comfort. "The quality is exceptional. It will pick up a whisper from across the room." She pointed to a tiny, almost invisible seam on the side. "1 click here to turn it on. A small green light will flash, once then go dark. It'll be recording. Click it again to turn it off." Elizabeth closed her hand around it, a small piece of metal to capture the implosion of a family. "Thank you, Mia." Grandma Mia said, her eyes pleading. "Be careful." "The time for being careful is over," Elizabeth replied, and the words felt truer than anything she had said in years. After Mia left, Elizabeth sat in the quiet for a long time, the brooch in her hand. Then she picked up the phone and dialed Jacob's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice wary. "Mom." "Jacob?" She said, her tone deliberately placid, betraying none of the storm inside her. I've been thinking. Perhaps I was too hasty. I'd like you to come over. I think we need to talk. About my future. About Maple Creek Meadows. She could almost hear the gears turning in his head, the cautious optimism blooming into relief. He thought he'd won. He thought her spirit had finally broken. Of course, Mom. Yes, that's a good idea. I'll be there this afternoon. The bait was taken. She hung up the phone and walked to her bedroom, pinning the silver knot to the collar of her blouse. It lay against her skin, cold and watchful. When Jacob arrived, he brought the sunshine in with him, a forced, brittle cheerfulness that didn't reach his eyes. He kissed her on the cheek, a gesture so routine it was meaningless. Mom, I'm so glad you called. I knew you'd come around. It's for the best you'll see. You'll be safe there, cared for. No more worrying about the house, the bills. He was a salesman. A desperate, sweating salesman pitching his mother's cage, and he didn't even see the bars. Would you like some coffee? Jacob Elizabeth asked, her voice smooth as glass. Sure, that would be great. She moved to the kitchen, her motions calm and deliberate. She could feel the slight weight of the brooch on her blouse, a silent accomplice. She prepared the coffee, just as he liked it, with a splash of cream, and carried the mug back into the living room. The room where they'd celebrated birthdays, opened Christmas presents, and sat in stunned silence after his father's funeral. Now it was a stage. He took a sip of the coffee, a smug satisfaction settling on his face. So, about Maple Creek. Sophia and I went over the paperwork again. The amenities are just wonderful. There's a heated pool, a book club. Elizabeth let him talk for another minute, letting the rope of his own delusion unspool. Then she held up a hand. Stop, Jacob. He blinked, taken aback. What? She didn't raise her voice. She simply leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. She reached for the single yellowed letter she'd left on the coffee table, the first one Richard had ever received. With 2 fingers, she slid it across the polished wood until it stopped just inches from his hand. I don't want to talk about Maple Creek, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, a whisper that carried the force of a landslide. I want to talk about this. Jacob's eyes fell to the letter. He didn't need to read it. He recognized the cheap paper, the stark-typed font. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy grey pallor. The confident posture, the relieved smile, it all dissolved in an instant, like sugar in water. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with a confusion that was rapidly curdling into sheer animal panic. Where did you get that? He stammered, his hand twitching at his side. Elizabeth ignored his question. She let the silence stretch, letting him drown in it. Then she delivered the final blow. I know about the payments, Jacob, she said, her voice utterly devoid of emotion. I know everything. I know what your father did. That was it. That was the key that unlocked the dam. A strangled sob tore from Jacob's throat. It wasn't a cry of grief. It was a sound of catastrophic failure, of a structure collapsing under a weight it had borne for too long. His body seemed to fold in on itself. He slumped forward in the armchair, his head in his hands, and began to weep. Not quiet, dignified tears, but ragged, heaving gasps that shook his entire frame. The man who had tried to steal her home, her autonomy, her future was gone. In his place was a broken, terrified boy. Elizabeth just watched her heart, a cold, still stone in her chest. The tiny recorder on her collar listened, capturing every desperate, wrenching sound. I was a kid. He finally choked out his voice, muffled by his hands. I was 17? I was in the house. He came home late. I heard him being sick in the bathroom, violently sick. The next morning he looked like he'd aged 20 years. He told me he hit something on the way home from the city. A deer, he said. He was so adamant. A deer. He looked up at her, his face a mess of tears and shame. But his car? The front was smashed in. There was a dent on the hood. I knew it wasn't a deer. A week later, I saw the article in the paper. A young woman. A hit and run on the old highway. They never found the driver. I knew, Mom. I knew it was him. He took a ragged breath, the confession now a torrent he couldn't control. He made me promise. On his life, on my life, on the family's name. He said it was a moment of panic, a terrible, unforgivable mistake, but that telling the truth would destroy us all, the business, our reputation, everything. He made me his accomplice in the silence. The first letter arrived a few years later, then another, and another. He paid them, a few $1,000s every few months. He called it legacy maintenance. A sick joke. When he got sick, when he knew he was dying, he told me it was my responsibility now, to protect the family, to keep the secret buried. Jacob's words tumbled out fragmented and raw. He talked about the suffocating pressure, the constant fear of exposure. The blackmailer was a faceless entity, a ghost that haunted his life, its demands growing more insistent, more expensive over the years. I couldn't keep up. He whispered, his voice hoarse. The business wasn't what it used to be. I was sinking, drowning in it. And then Sophia. He paused, a new kind of agony twisting his features. It was her idea, he said, the words barely audible. All of it. She saw how desperate I was. She found the forged power of attorney Richard had used once for a business deal. She found the old letterhead. She said it was the only way. The only way to get a big enough lump sum to pay them off for good. One final payment, to make them go away forever. He was looking at his mother now, his eyes pleading for an understanding she would not give him. She convinced me it was a kindness, Mom. Can you believe that? A kindness. To you. Move you somewhere safe, sell the house, use the money to end this nightmare. She said we were protecting the family legacy, Richard's legacy. She said it was what he would have wanted. And I was so tired, so afraid. I believed her. I let her do it. I helped her do it. He buried his face in his hands again, his shoulders shaking with the full, devastating weight of his confession. He had been manipulated. A weak man, a guilty son, twisted into a tool by his wife's ambition. He had betrayed his mother to protect the memory of a father who was a killer, all at the urging of the woman he loved. Elizabeth sat in her chair, a statue carved from ice. She felt nothing, no anger, no pity, just a vast, hollow emptiness. The recording was complete. The truth in all its ugly, pathetic detail was captured. Jacob eventually stumbled out of the house, a man hollowed out, leaving behind a silence thick with the residue of his broken life. Elizabeth didn't watch him go. She sat perfectly still for over an hour. Then, with a steady hand, she reached up and clicked the brooch a second time. The next morning, she was in David Chen's office. The space was all clean lines, glass, and brushed steel, a world away from the dusty secrets and moral decay of her own home. She didn't speak at first. She simply placed a small USB drive on his polished desk. "This is a recording of a conversation I had with my son yesterday," she said. She also pushed a pristine copy of the old newspaper clipping across the desk. And this is the event that started it all. David's expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes were sharp. He inserted the drive into his laptop, put on a pair of headphones, and pressed play. Elizabeth watched his face as he listened. She saw his eyebrows draw together, his jaw tighten. She saw the moment his professional focus shifted into something more personal, more intense. He listened to the entire thing without interruption. When it was over, he took off the headphones and let out a long, slow breath. "My God, Elizabeth." He was quiet for a moment, processing. "Okay," he said, his lawyerly composure returning. Here's where we stand. The fraud, the forgery, the coercion, that's all clear as day. We have him, and by extension, we have Sophia. The confession is ironclad. He tapped the newspaper clipping. This is more complicated. The hit and run was 30 years ago. The statute of limitations on criminal charges like vehicular manslaughter has long since passed. We can't put your late husband on trial. Elizabeth nodded. She had expected that. However, David continued leaning forward. That doesn't mean there's no recourse. The statute of limitations for filing a civil wrongful death suit is often different, especially if there's evidence of fraudulent concealment, which this blackmail and cover-up clearly is. The family of the victim could theoretically sue your husband's estate for damages. He paused. Which is now your estate. The irony was not lost on her. So I could be sued for what he did. It's a possibility, David admitted. My investigator is a retired police detective. He's very good. I'm going to have him pull the original complete cold case file from the archives. There might be something in there we can use, something that gives us leverage. The victim's name was Amelia Vance. We'll start there. I'll be in touch as soon as I have anything. The days that followed were a strange limbo. The house was no longer a home. It was a crime scene. Every object held a new, sinister meaning. The family photos on the mantelpiece were portraits of liars and ghosts. She moved through the rooms like a phantom waiting. The call came 4 days later. Elizabeth, it's David Chen. Are you sitting down? His voice was different. The professional calm was gone, replaced by a tense, strained quality she had never heard before. I am, she said, her knuckles white as she gripped the phone. My investigator got the full file, the original police report from 1995. It's detailed. They canvassed the area, interviewed friends, family, the usual. He hesitated, and in that small gap of silence, Elizabeth felt a cold dread begin to creep up her spine. They interviewed the victim's family at the time David said his words, measured and heavy. Amelia Vance. She wasn't alone in the world. She had a sister, an older sister who lived with her. She was the one who identified the body. She gave the police a statement. He took a sharp breath. Elizabeth. The sister's name was Sophia. The world stopped. The name hung in the air, electric and impossible. Sophia. Vance David repeated, his voice tight with the enormity of what he was saying. The woman your husband killed on that road 30 years ago. It was Sophia's sister. It wasn't a wave of shock that hit Elizabeth. It was a bolt of lightning, a moment of terrible, absolute, horrifying clarity. Every memory of Sophia from the last 2 decades flashed through her mind, but now they were lit by this new, monstrous light. Her charming smile when Jacob introduced them. Her quiet support during Richard's illness. Her calculated concern after the funeral. Her gentle insistence on securing Elizabeth's future. Her hand guiding Jacob's convincing a weak man to betray his own mother. It was never about the money, the forgery, the manipulation, the slow, systematic dismantling of the Sterling family. It was never about greed. It was a masterpiece. A meticulous, patient, decades-long plot for revenge. She hadn't married a man. She had married a name. She had embedded herself in the heart of the family that had destroyed hers, and she had waited. She had waited for the perfect moment to burn it all to the ground from the inside out. Elizabeth looked around the silent living room at the ghosts of her past. The money, the house, the precious family legacy. It was never the target. It was just the weapon. The target was them. The target was always only them. The air in the living room was different. It was the same space filled with the same heavy, dark furniture Richard had chosen decades ago, the same portraits on the wall, their painted eyes following the living. But the silence was no longer one of grief. It was the taut, humming silence of a wire about to snap. Elizabeth sat in her usual armchair, a small, unassuming digital audio recorder resting on the polished mahogany of the end table beside her. It was so small, so modern. It looked out of place like a piece of the future that had fallen into a museum exhibit. Jacob shifted in his seat on the sofa, his knee bouncing with a nervous energy that seemed to shake the whole room. He kept glancing at his wife Sophia, who sat beside him, a portrait of unnerving calm. She was perfectly composed, her hands folded in her lap, her expression one of patient concern. It was a mask she wore so well, Elizabeth thought, a mask she had been wearing for 22 years. "Thank you for coming," Elizabeth said, her voice steady, clear. It didn't sound like the voice of a frail, confused old woman. It sounded like a judge about to read a verdict. "I know you're both very busy." Jacob cleared his throat. "Of course, Mom. Anything. Is is everything okay? You sounded so formal on the phone. I just felt it was time for a family meeting." Elizabeth replied, her eyes moving from her son to her daughter-in-law, to clear the air, about everything. Sophia offered a small, sympathetic smile. "Elizabeth, if this is about Maple Creek, we can talk about it. We know it's a big decision. Jacob and I only want what's best for you. Your safety, your comfort." Her voice was smooth as silk, each word coated in a layer of feigned sincerity. Elizabeth let the words hang in the air, then she reached over and pressed a button on the small silver recorder. A sound filled the room. The hiss of a recording, then a voice. Jacob's voice. "I didn't know what else to do. He had me, Mom. He's had me for years. Since Dad first brought me into the business." Jacob froze. The bouncing in his legs stopped. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly grey pallor. He stared at the little silver device as if it were a snake. "Sophia said it was the only way. She said we needed the capital, a big lump sum to finally pay him off for good, to end it. She said you'd never agree to sell, but that it was for the best, to protect Dad's name, to protect me. She showed me how to practice your signature, how to set up the trust. She said it was a victimless crime, just moving money around." Jacob's head slumped forward, his face in his hands. A low, wretched sound escaped his throat, a moan of utter and complete defeat. He was a marionette whose strings had been cut, a hollowed-out man collapsing in on himself. He didn't even look at his wife. He couldn't. Elizabeth watched him, a pang of something ancient and maternal twisting in her gut. But it was overshadowed by a cold, hard resolve. She turned her gaze to Sophia. Sophia hadn't moved. Her hands were still folded. Her posture was still perfect. But the mask of concern had vanished. In its place was a look of bored appraisal. She watched Jacob's pathetic, shuddering form for a moment, then her eyes lifted to meet Elizabeth's. And then she began to clap. It wasn't loud or boisterous. It was a slow, deliberate, rhythmic clap. Each impact of her palms was a punctuation mark in the suffocating silence of the room. A gunshot. Another. Another. "Bravo, Elizabeth," Sophia said, her voice devoid of its silky warmth. It was flat cold, sharp as a shard of glass. "Bravo. It took you long enough. I was beginning to think you'd just let it happen, that you'd just wither away in that beige little room at Maple Creek, and I wouldn't even get to see this part." Jacob's head snapped up, his eyes wide with confusion and horror. "Sophia, what are you talking about? What is this?" Sophia ignored him, her entire focus on Elizabeth. She rose from the sofa with a fluid, predatory grace and began to walk around the room, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. She ran a finger along the back of Richard's favourite reading chair, leaving a trail in the dust. "This room," she said, a sneer twisting her lips. "My God, this room. The monument to Richard Sterling, the great man, the pillar of the community." Do you know how many nights I sat in here drinking your bland little cups of tea, listening to his self-important stories and just imagining it all burning, imagining the flames licking up these ugly velvet curtains? She stopped in front of a framed photo of a smiling younger Jacob, standing with his arm around her on their wedding day. She stared at it, her head tilted. You know, I almost felt sorry for him sometimes, she said, gesturing vaguely at her husband. It was just so easy. When I first met him back in college, he was like a puppy, so desperate for approval, so desperate to live up to the sterling name. His father's shadow was so long he didn't even know what it was like to stand in the sun. Sophia, please, Jacob, whispered, his voice cracking. Stop. What are you doing? I'm telling a story, Jacob, she shot back, her voice like a whip. Our story. You should listen. It's a good one. She turned back to Elizabeth. I targeted him, you know. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a chance meeting in the university library. I saw his name on a class roster, Jacob Sterling. I knew that name. Oh, yes. I knew it very, very well. I read everything I could about your family. I learned about his hobbies, his favorite music, the classes he was taking. I engineered our first meeting down to the second. I became the perfect girl for him. Interested in business, but not too aggressive. Appreciative of family tradition. Quiet. Supportive. Everything his father would want in a daughter-in-law. Everything he thought he wanted in a wife. She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that held no humor. And you all bought it. You, Elizabeth. You loved me. You told your friends I was a lovely girl, so good for Jacob. And Richard, even Richard, the great discerning patriarch, he approved. He saw me as an asset, another piece of property to add to the Sterling portfolio. The irony is delicious, don't you think? Elizabeth said nothing. She just watched her heart, a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She was no longer a participant. She was a witness. Sophia continued her slow patrol of the room. For 22 years I played my part. I hosted your boring dinner parties. I remembered your birthdays. I produced your heirs. And every single day I was planting seeds. A little whisper here about a risky investment. A little nudge there toward a business partner I knew was unreliable. I didn't have to do much. His ego did most of the work. He was so desperate to prove he was a bigger man than his father that he took every risk, made every foolish choice. All I did was make sure the safety nets had holes in them. She stopped at the fireplace, staring up at the grand portrait of Richard Sterling that hung above it. His painted face was stern, confident judging. My sister had a name, Sophia said, her voice dropping to a low, intense hiss. It was Amelia. Amelia Vance. She was 17. She wanted to be a veterinarian. She loved to draw. She had this laugh. It was the kind of laugh that made other people start laughing even if they didn't know the joke. Jacob was staring at her now, his face a mask of dawning, sickening comprehension. The name, Vance. It sounded familiar. A file. A box. A secret. Your husband, Elizabeth Sophia, said, turning from the portrait, her eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. Your sainted Richard. He was driving drunk. He hit her car and he just kept going. Left her to die on the side of a dark road. He never stopped. He never called for help. He just went home to his perfect house and his perfect family and erased it. But you can't erase a person. Not really. She finally looked at Jacob, a cruel, pitying smile on her face. You know the rest, don't you, my love? The blackmail. It wasn't some random parasite. It was the tow truck driver who was first on the scene. He recognized the car model, saw a piece of the grille that had broken off. A few weeks later, he saw Richard's pristine car with a brand new grille and put it all together. And for 15 years, he bled your father dry. And then when dear old Dad brought his precious son into the business, he passed that burden right along to you. The legacy maintenance fee. That's what your father called it, wasn't it? To protect the sterling legacy. She took a step toward him. He flinched back, as if she were about to strike him. I knew all of it. I found the payment ledgers years ago. And I waited. I waited for the perfect moment. For you to be desperate enough for the blackmail payments to be high enough that when I presented my solution, you would be too weak and too stupid to say no. Taking this house. Taking her money. It wasn't about getting rich, Jacob. I was never interested in the money. Her voice dropped to a venomous whisper, each word a carefully aimed dart. I wanted to see you lose everything just like I did. I wanted to see the sterling name, the name your father killed for dragged through the mud and publicly humiliated. I wanted to watch the foundation of your entire life crumble into dust. Your father took my family. She spat, her face contorted with 2 decades of repressed fury. So I took his. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. Jacob stared at the woman he had shared a bed with for over 20 years, the mother of his children, the woman he loved. He looked at her face, and for the first time he saw a complete stranger, a monster wearing the face of his wife. The betrayal of the forged signature, the theft, the lies, it was all nothing. A puff of smoke compared to this inferno. His entire adult life, his marriage, his family, it was all a lie. A tool, a weapon in a war he never even knew was being fought. He wasn't just heartbroken, he was unmade. Every memory he had was now tainted, poisoned. Their first date, their wedding, the birth of their children, were her smiles real? Were her tears? Was any of it? He felt a hollowing out inside him so vast and so complete, he thought he might simply cease to exist. His hands began to shake, not with fear or anger, but with the tremors of a man whose entire reality has been violently and irrevocably shattered. Sophia was still talking, her voice rising now, savoring the moment, explaining the beautiful architecture of her revenge. She was monologuing, performing her victory speech for an audience of the damned. She gestured around the room at the furniture, the photos. And the best part, the most perfect part, is that you did it to yourselves. You handed me the knife, Jacob. You plunged it into your own family's heart. But Jacob wasn't listening anymore. He was looking past her at his mother. Elizabeth sat there still and silent, her expression unreadable. But in her eyes he saw not condemnation, but a deep, sorrowful understanding. She knew. She had known. And in that moment he realized what he had to do. It wasn't for his father's legacy. That was a lie built on a crime. It wasn't for Sophia. She was a ghost. It was for the last, tiny, flickering ember of himself that wasn't a lie. While Sophia was still basking in the glow of her triumph, Jacob's trembling hand slowly reached into his pocket. He pulled out his phone. His fingers were clumsy, numb. He fumbled with the screen, his thumbs swiping uselessly at the glass. Finally, he managed to unlock it and tap the green phone icon. He pressed the 3 numbers he knew would end everything. He lifted the phone to his ear. Sophia was still talking, but her voice seemed to be coming from a great distance. His own voice, when it came, was a barely audible whisper, a ghost of a sound. I need to report a crime. He paused, swallowing hard against the lump of ash in his throat. Several, actually. He kept his eyes locked on his mother's. He was a child again, lost and broken, begging for an absolution she could not give. An absolution he did not deserve. Elizabeth held his gaze. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply gave him one slow, deliberate nod. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance, an end. That's when Sophia finally stopped talking. The sound of her son's voice, quiet as it was, had cut through her victory speech. She turned, her brow furrowed in annoyance, and saw the phone in his hand. She saw the look on his face. She saw the single nod from Elizabeth. and the triumphant, gloating mask on her face dissolved. It melted away, replaced by a look of pure, uncomprehending shock. Her plan. Her perfect, patient, decades-long plan. It wasn't supposed to end like this. It was supposed to end with her walking away, leaving them in their ruin. Not with this. Not with him. Her shock curdled instantly into a wave of black, furious rage. Her mouth opened a silent scream of fury forming on her lips, and in that charged, silent moment, a new sound began to filter in from the outside world. Faint at first. A distant, mournful wail, then growing louder, closer. A rhythmic, piercing cry cutting through the quiet suburban streets of Havenwood. The sound of sirens. 6 months later, the Oregon sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The house on Sycamore Lane had a "sold" sign staked into its manicured lawn. The Sterling name, once a symbol of quiet prosperity in Havenwood, was now a local legend of a different sort. It was whispered in coffee shops, splashed across the websites of local news outlets, and dissected in short, dramatic videos on TikTok, complete with spooky music and grainy photos of the family. The Sterling curse, they called it. The decades-long revenge of the perfect wife. Sophia Vance was convicted on multiple felony counts. Fraud, conspiracy, extortion. The prosecutor had laid out the intricate, chilling architecture of her revenge for the jury. Her composure in the courtroom had been as flawless as it was in Elizabeth's living room, which the media said only made her seem more monstrous. She received a sentence that ensured she would be an old woman before she ever saw the outside of a prison wall again. Jacob, for his full and immediate cooperation against both Sophia and the now identified blackmailer, received a significantly reduced sentence. His confession, his testimony, and his palpable remorse had painted him not as a master manipulator, but as a weak man, a broken man manipulated by two forces far stronger than he was his father's ghost and the woman who had pretended to love him. His punishment was real, but his true sentence was the life he now had to live, knowing none of it had been real at all. Elizabeth Sterling now lived in a bright, airy apartment in a city 2 states away. The walls were white, the furniture was modern and light, and the windows were huge, letting the sun pour in. It was half the size of the Havenwood house and felt 10 times larger. It was close to Mia's university, and the sounds of the city of life, of traffic, of people moving forward were a constant, comforting hum. The final scene of the Sterling saga didn't take place in a courtroom or a dark, imposing living room. It took place on a small balcony under the warm afternoon sun. Elizabeth stood beside her granddaughter Mia in front of a large pot where a young tomato plant was reaching for the sky. "You see here," Elizabeth said, her voice gentle. She pointed a steady finger at a tiny sprout emerging from the base of the main stem. "This is a sucker. If you let it grow, it takes energy away from the main plant, and you get fewer tomatoes. You have to pinch it off." She demonstrated her fingers, deft and sure, pinching the small green shoot away. "Sometimes you have to prune things away to let the real growth happen." Mia watched her, expression thoughtful. She looked around the balcony at the other pots of herbs and flowers. "It's nice here, Grandma," she said. She paused, then asked the question that had been lingering. "Do you ever miss it, the old house?" Elizabeth stopped her work. She looked out past the balcony railing at the skyline of the city, at the cranes building new towers at the endless blue above. A faint, genuine smile touched her lips. It was a smile that had been absent for years, and it reached all the way to her eyes. "It was never a home, Mia," she said softly, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "For a very long time I thought it was. But it was just a house, a museum of secrets and sad memories." She turned back to the tomato plant, to the new life growing in the sun. She picked up the small pruning shears from the ledge beside the pot. "This," she said, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable peace, This is a home. She held the shears out to Mia, offering them to her. A passing of the torch. Not a legacy of secrets and lies of maintenance fees and hidden boxes, but one of resilience, one of growth, a legacy of knowing when to prune the dead weight away and how to start again.